All right, so we are recording the specular reflection lecture, and the main thing we're going to be kind of focusing on today, if you kind of just check out the materials over here, is we're primarily hanging out in this diffuse section. All right, we're just getting our color connected. Some of you guys might have been using like the gain slider to darken things a little bit. A few of you may have been darkening it right on the file node using the color gain on that. That's just trying to get the intensity of the texture to match the reference. And we didn't really talk about it a whole lot, but the alternative would be if you had darkened a light in the scene to get the texture to match the reference, what would have been the issue with that? Like if you were working on a project, you saw that one of the objects just felt unusually bright, so you start knocking down light intensity. What would be the problem? Yeah, I mean, you're affecting everything, right? The lights are doing a lot more than just that one texture. You're going to see highlights start dropping down, like the reflection of the light. The other objects that are being hit by that light are also going to start dropping down in intensity. So this was our local way to kind of correct that. Now the stuff we're getting into today is going to be down below it in the primary, rough, and clear coat sections. Now if you just, I know there's a lot of stuff here and you can see that, but if you just look at each section individually, see how they look exactly the same? The only thing changing is like a roughness number, but like they both have face and edge colors, face and edge color, exponent. If I go down to the clear coat, again, different roughness, but it has the exact same attributes. So what these sections are doing, there are three different areas where we can change the reflectivity of an object. Why do you think that we would want so many different sections all doing the same thing? Because if you, by the way, if you change the roughness to the same number on all these, they all render the exact same. So they're not really different. But why do you think the material would want to give you three different types of areas for that? Yeah. Oh, I saw your hand flail. Say it again? Yeah, it definitely has to do with like the type of the material. Yeah, that's kind of a big one. So when you start really thinking about the way materials are layered, I think we even talked about this in the last lecture a little bit, but like the idea of a clear coat. Let's say you're doing car paint. The clear coat is over the top of the car paint, right? It's like the shiny, buffed layer of everything. So the clear coat has its own reflection, but then beneath that, doesn't the paint itself has its own reflection as well, kind of below the clear coat? Then you've got paint flakes. They kind of reflect their own way. So when you start thinking about materials, sometimes you'll realize that the thing you're creating has multiple layers that you're trying to recreate. It's not just, is it reflective? What are the different parts of the material? And you can kind of break that down. But since these all do the same thing, we're not really going to be using these bottom ones here. I'm not going to be doing rough spec. We're not doing clear coat. We just don't need it for this particular project. So we're primarily going to be focusing just on the primary specular. But again, remember, anything you guys do to this area, you could do in any of the other ones, a combination of two different sections to get the desired result. So I think to kind of start this off, instead of us jumping in here immediately and trying to like render and texture these guys, let's go to the display layers. And you'll notice at the bottom, all of the objects are on this kind of one giant display layer. I'm just going to turn that off and just use this guy for a little bit. Just a sphere, just to kind of render a few different materials and kind of talk about how this works. All right. So I'm just going to kick off an IPR, just kind of see what the render looks like, just using that same camera. There we go, it's beautiful. So we kind of have that sort of gray default material right now. We have nothing reflective on this guy at all. Have you guys had a chance to go digging through the preset browser yet? So right up here at the top, it is this guy right here. Kind of looks like a little shader ball. Just hit that for me. Like, let's go in the preset browser, and that should pop up somewhere. I'll move mine over here. There we go. Okay. So inside of the preset browser, this is obviously going to come with a lot of different materials that we could use. And most of these do have some degree of reflectivity. I mean, you can all tell they're shiny. Let's just try creating a couple different ones just to kind of see what they look like. So the way to do that is if you have your object selected and you're kind of looking at the preset browser, which again is that button right there. What do you guys want to make today out of the list? Any of these sound exciting? Composite. Ooh, carbon fiber. Sweet. Let's jump right into carbon fiber. So we have two different types of carbon fiber. You can tell they have their own textures built into it. So if you have an object selected, if you right-click on the material that you just want to kind of look into, you want to so importing it is just going to throw it in the Hypershade, meaning you could kind of come back to that later. Import and assign to selected obviously means it's going to bring it in the Hypershade and it would assign it to that object, which we're going to do for right now. So import and assign. It's on there, and now you can see this is trying to render that. Let me actually cancel that just in case and just redo the IPR. I haven't looked at this particular carbon fiber. Yeah, this one I think needs a lot more to reflect. It looks like it's missing a lot of reflection detail. Try doing that again. You guys getting a very similar effect? Yeah. I have a feeling like some of this is not reflecting. There's probably nothing above the screen, above the scene for it to actually capture a lot of information. But we are getting both the area lights reflecting quite a bit. Let me try to hop into like an acrylic. Those are a little simpler. So I'm going to try doing, let's do the violet acrylic. Import and assign. Here's violet. So what is really like happening on this material? So the cool thing is like if you guys are ever unsure how to use the material, like build something from scratch, because obviously you guys are going to get to the point where you could make this or you could make it yourself like from scratch. You can still dissect these and figure out what this material is. If you just like go to the material attributes on that particular guy, if I right click, not that, right click and go to material attributes at the bottom, you can kind of see what this is made up of. We have like a purple color, that's right, our kind of our texture, just simple right there. We have some subtle adjustments to face and edge color. There's an exponent adjustment, roughness. I know you guys don't know what much of this means quite yet, but that's kind of the result we're getting. So it's mainly a purple diffuse color with some reflection properties on top of that. And a lot of those acrylics will kind of do the exact same thing. So if I go back in here and pick another one, I'm willing to bet these are probably the exact same thing, just with a different diffuse color. And we also have metallics down here. These guys are kind of interesting. If you go into the metallics, these you're going to see change something with the specular part of the material. Like let's try the copper one, or gold, or brass. Pick one with kind of an interesting color and just try assigning that. Here's copper. Kind of has like a hammered look to it. So there's most likely one of Pixar's patterns is plugged into the bump on this one, which is why it's kind of breaking up in that effect. But let's just kind of look at the material itself and just look at the properties on this. So material attributes. You can tell this time when I go into it for copper, this looks a lot different. This whole section right here is changed. We have edge color, refraction index, coefficient. So what is changing over here? Well, anytime we work on a material, when you're doing specular components, you basically have two different ways that you guys can create specularity on something. You can do the artistic way, which is basically just you guys playing around with colors and values until it just kind of feels right. And there's also going to be the physically correct way. These are a little bit more advanced. But when you get into the physical settings, you can actually look up the numbers for a metal, put the numbers in these attributes, and your material will reflect just like the metal. I mean, do you guys remember when you were in shading and lighting and Tony was talking to you guys about what the index of refraction was? Do you remember like what that is? I know you were all playing around with it for glass. Yeah, It is. It's not like a Maya thing or a Mental Ray or a RenderMan thing that use it, but when you look up index refraction, it is actually like a value coming from physics. If you do a search for it, you're going to end up on like physics pages. Like one that pops up for me a lot is hyperphysics. It's a lot of college pages that just break down what these are doing. But it's kind of cool knowing that sometimes there's just a right answer. You don't have to guess to make it look like copper or gold. If you just look up the numbers, punch them in here, it will do that. But thankfully, like RenderMan does have a pretty good preset browser, where if you wanted to, you could use these as a starting point. So I could go in there to copper or mercury, assign those. You can kind of see they're all just a little different with their tints. Some are slightly warmer, greener, more blue. But they would all give you a really nice, accurate result. So let's just kind of start over with this one. Instead of using one of their presets, and you guys, by the way, are more than welcome to use those when you do these guys right here. I just want you to kind of go through the preset browser and just kind of see which one you want to do. I think in my example, I did nickel, but you guys can pick whatever metal you want from the list. I just want to see you kind of experiment and play around with that when you get in the lab and see which one you guys like. All right, let's try building this one from scratch, though, instead of relying on the presets this time. Okay, let's go into the Hypershade. I've already got this wonderful error from my material viewer. Did you guys notice that thing would break down pretty quick? Yeah, this is kind of why I close it out, because I'm just opening the scene up. The thing's already dead, so that's completely useless to me. So for now, I'm just going to close out of the material viewer since it's not responding. It's probably something they're going to address in the next update, but there's definitely something broken with that guy. All right. So in the Hypershade, let's just try making a new material. And you guys were probably using like the different tabs in the node graph like I was doing just to keep it organized. Let's try making a brand new one and just play around with some of the reflection settings on that. So remember, you guys can use tab. Just type in PXR surface, or like we mentioned before, the surface material is right there at the top in this shelf. Right click, Pixar surface. And then I want you guys to assign that to the little ball. We're just going to play around with a couple things. So there we go. My IPR has been running the whole time. I've been kind of swapping out materials. But you can see it's sort of turning back to the way it was before, just that kind of default gray. Now, over here, what we're going to do is let's completely kill the diffuse for a second, just to remove all the texture color so we're not seeing that. So we can either take the gray color to black or slam the gain down. Maybe we'll turn the gain down to 0. So we're effectively not getting any diffuse detail. Now, because the primary spec area doesn't really have any adjustments, you can see it starts off as just like a lot of black. It's not really doing anything. So we'll kind of talk about what this artistic mode does first. When you guys were doing the MIA material, do you remember that area on it where it said BRDF? And yeah, Bertif and Frank in the lab probably said something like bring really drunk friends. Does that sound familiar? No, not at all. Okay, he stopped using that. That's good. It does not stand for bring really drunk friends, but that whole section where you were probably turning on the Fresnel reflection checkbox when you're doing like a glass, maybe like one of the wine bottles, that's kind of related to what this whole area is doing right here. So let's try a couple of things out. Let's leave the face color to black, but crank up the edge color. Let's go all the way to white. Now, when you end up cranking the color up to white, which seems like max intensity, right? Because black, we weren't getting anything. Does that feel like max intensity for reflection? Like, what should something that is 100% reflective look like? White, it should be, like, what object is 100% reflective in the real world? Chrome, a mirror, right? I mean, a lot of very, very polished metals. So we got this guy cranked up to 1. That doesn't look like a mirror. Now, it is looking kind of like a plastic a little bit, like a black marble. So why are we not getting the mirror effect? It's because of how these two attributes work together. What you're seeing is with reflections, we want something called a Fresnel reflection. And a Fresnel reflection, just in case you guys don't remember, that's the effect where when you're looking at something head on, you have one reflection value, but as the normals change to the side and you have a perpendicular angle, those reflections need to be more intense. So it basically means like looking at this little ball, the reflections in the center are less than the reflections as it transitions to the edge. So there is a variation of reflection intensity. The Maya materials can't do that. So if you guys ever go back to like blends and Feng-Yis, they can't do that stuff. You have to build it yourself through a lot of weird utility nodes. But this has it built right in, and we definitely want that because this is a believable, realistic effect. Now, if I did want to make this thing look like a mirror, if I take the face color, because in the middle, if it's set to black, that dead center right there is not reflective at all. It's not doing anything. It's going to 100% on the edge. But if you crank up the face color to white, look what we get. Now we have a mirror, right? This looks like a chrome ball. You can see everything that's reflecting, like the ground. There's that dome light above the scene that has the texture on it. You can see both of the different area lights all appearing inside of the render. One's a rectangle, one's a disc. So this thing effectively looks like a mirror just by cranking these guys up. Now watch what happens if we change the color for this, because right now we have it at white. Let's try doing, we're gonna do a couple weird things here. Let's change the edge color to, we do pink a lot. Let's not do pink. Green. It's gonna pick a green edge color. Might have to saturate that a little more. I don't know if it's gonna show up. Let me try changing the face to a different color. Okay, it's doing it. Yeah, it's hard to see because that edge color is really subtle. It doesn't kick in until almost right on the edge. Let me make it a little warmer. So I'm picking almost an orange face and a green edge. Can you guys see that transition where it's kind of going between the two? So we're doing it with color, but that's kind of visually what those guys are doing. The face is the center, has a kind of almost a copper tone to it right now, but then as it goes around the edge, you can see it's blending into this other color we're picking for the edge. All right, let's kind of drop those back. I'm going to put the face color back to black and edge to white again, just like we had it earlier. Now below that on the whole artistic section, you can see there's something called exponent, and we have roughness. The exponent you guys probably won't have to really mess around with a whole lot. This was also on the MIA material when you guys were playing around with it, but what the exponent does is, like, notice how I'm not going to change the face and the edge color. So the center and the edge values are going to stay the same, but watch what happens if I bring this exponent up. Like if I just go to 8. What does it look like is happening to my reflection if I do that? It's disappearing, right? Let me go down to like 2. We'll go below 5. So what this is doing is if you have these two numbers right here, just think of it kind of like the curves in Photoshop where you're looking at that kind of straight line and you're playing around with the two different numbers for the center and the edge. What that exponent's doing is think of it like bending the curve. You're adjusting the transition between the two numbers. You actually can almost visually see it right there. See that kind of gradient of darker value and kind of how it builds up right there? That's all happening because of the exponent. So visually, it just kind of, you can use the exponent to kind of exaggerate the reflectivity in the center if you're trying to do something with a little bit more pronounced reflections, like maybe a car paint. I'm going to bump up my face color just a little bit so you can see this a little easier. There we go. And the last part here is going to be roughness. So roughness is something we definitely want to take advantage of. This is an extremely powerful attribute because when you're defining reflectivity, it's not just how shiny is it, like from 0 to 1. let's check out the roughness. So I'm going to leave face and edge exactly the same. Watch what happens when I bring the roughness down. What's happening to my reflection when I do that? Yeah, it's sharper, right? And if I go up, I'm sure you guys already know what's going to happen. We'll do like 0.7 or 0.8. Now it's like it's diffusing everything. Right now we're getting like a much rougher, blurrier effect from the reflection. Now the grain looks awful when you do that because it has to sample a lot more to figure out how to blur the area lights and all the reflections. But think of this like a blurring effect. Now let's kind of step away from Maya for a second. But in the real world, where do you guys see variations of roughness? Like where in the room we're in right now, do you see materials that are rough, where the reflection is not a perfect flat shape? Yeah, the wall, the laptop, like almost every material in the room. I mean, on the flip side, what materials in here do you think you would never use roughness on? Like that you would not want the reflection to be blurry? The windows, the glass is an awesome example of that. Those are pretty damn clean, right? So what is it you think that makes the glass different than, say, like the desk we're sitting at? Because I'm sure when you guys are looking towards the projector, can you see that like reflecting off the table like a glow a little bit? But you can't make out what it's, like you can't look at the reflection and see anything on the screen, right? It's not like you can make out the text in my attributes or any of that stuff. It's just like a blurred reflection. So what is it about this you think that's making it blur it compared to the window or the glass? Yeah, the roughness, the thing we're talking about, because there's a texture to it, right? If you thoughts, yeah. Exactly. So the only difference is this has tiny imperfections and rough properties to it, hence why it's called roughness. That obviously is very smooth and polished. So what is this kind of similar to? This is really similar to bump, right? Isn't that kind of what bump does? Is give you those little tiny surface imperfections. So you can think of roughness as being the exact same thing. It's almost like when you're building a material in a mesh, you kind of want to start thinking about the different levels of detail. So we'll kind of break this down. At the top level, like let's say that you want to have the geometry modified so much that there needs to be actual dents and cracks in the surface that you can see. What would create that? Like if you want the surface to look like there are huge peaks and valleys and normal map would be pretty close, yeah. Bump kind of gets into that. Displacement's the big one because displacement is going to that's going to actually change the geometry itself. Like you'll see the whole thing change silhouette. You'll see pieces taken out of it. You guys were doing a little bit of that probably with maybe CDC when you guys were doing like your stuff in ZBrush. Yeah. You'd probably ideally use both. So displacement would be your broader shapes. Bump is like the next step down, where below displacement, then you start talking about, all right, now we need slightly smaller details for like small cracks. And I mean, this table, you probably wouldn't use a bump because the detail's not big enough to do that. But maybe like the carpet or the rug, like that. Scraper definitely has a lot of detail on it. That would need bump. So we have normal maps and bump maps for the next level down. And then below that, that's where we get into roughness. Roughness is even smaller scale. This is like the stuff where if you took like a magnifying glass and zoomed in on the surface, you'd see the little tiny dots from the bumps on that thing. That would be your roughness. So this starts at the larger scale, kind of a medium to small scale, and that's like microscopic scale. But together, and you can use these in any combination. You can have like if you guys did a character out of ZBrush, you might have a displacement map and a normal map, and there probably still would be a roughness texture on there as well. So you can definitely use these all together to get really believable results. So again, it's just surface imperfections. Let's try using a texture on it though. Because right now we're just like typing in a number and you're kind of seeing how blurry it makes the reflection. let's try doing a texture pattern. So what I'm going to do is off to the side here in the Hypershade, I'm going to go into my Create Node area, and let's go to maybe some of the Maya 3D textures. We'll check these out. And RenderMan does have a lot. There's a ton of different patterns in here. I'm just not going to use them right now because there's a couple issues like displaying them in the viewport. The Maya ones are a little bit easier to look at. You guys kind of know what most of these are doing. I don't know if you've like ever played around with them, just clicking on them randomly, assigning them to a material. Probably not. I mean, you probably know what they do. Like marble probably looks like marble. Let's do solid fractal, which is under 3D textures. I'm just making a solid fractal 3-dimensional texture. And we're going to be using these later on Friday. So I have solid fractal. And if you kind of look at it, this thing's basically just a little cloud pattern. I'm not going to get into what every attribute's doing, but just think of it like a cloud filter out of Photoshop, just a sort of noise effect. Let's assign that to the roughness parameter and just see what this does to it. So right now my roughness is 0.7. All I'm going to do is middle mouse drag that solid fractal to the roughness attribute. I'm just connecting it to it. That's what we're getting. So this is the fractal driving roughness. And you can kind of see the variation where there's some areas like through here where it looks really crisp and clean still, but notice there are pockets where it does get really blurry when you're looking at it. And I think I need to hit one checkbox on this. But, yeah. See how I'm doing that out alpha? Remember that whole alpha's luminance thing we talked about, like from the file nodes? When you guys have any out alpha connection coming from a file node, most likely you want that to have alpha's luminance turned on. That's in the color balance. You guys probably all did this when you did the color remapping on Friday, but this was on the file node as well. We're just turning that on. And let me redo the IPR just in case it's not accurate. It might be the same thing. Yeah, it still gives me the same result, so that's fine. But now we have variation to roughness. This means when you're kind of looking at a material, like with the pulley, you know how the pulley obviously is two different things. There's like the rusted metal and there's that blue paint on top of it. We know they shouldn't reflect the same way. They're not the same material. One's metal, one is a paint. So this is going to allow us eventually to control how the pulley reflects. So we can get the rusted metal part and the paint to do different things. We don't want them to look the same. All right, let's cancel out of that. So that's just a texture controlling roughness. We'll kind of get into more of that later. Let's go back here. And I'm just going to kind of reset everything back to default again. Let's kind of bring this to black, black, and roughness doesn't matter. We'll just do 0.5 for now. But just kind of turn all that stuff off. So this area is your artistic control. What I'm going to have you guys do, though, for the lab is we are going to stick with physical. Here's the one we're going to be doing. Now, if I go back and forth, just kind of look at what's changing. Here's artistic, face and edge, exponent, roughness. Let's go to physical. We don't have a face. We have an edge value. And then we have refraction index and coefficient. So these guys almost replaced the exponent slider we had. We still have roughness. So let's kind of try this one out and see how this one works instead. Let's do another IPR again. There we go. All right. So when you kind of first start this thing, you'll notice that nothing shows up at all. Move the edge color up. You can see that we're starting to get some reflectivity on it. So the edge kind of works the same way as sort of before, but the main difference here is instead of you guys changing this face color, the front one, and trying to figure out the balance between the two, This one's going to allow us to to hit space and play the sequence. That's fun. Don't hit the space bar. We can now use refraction index and coefficient to kind of more accurately get a better result. So the refraction index, this is the one where you guys can actually look up the number. And I'm going to kind of follow this just like the documentation, because you guys are going to start off just by changing these a little bit when you get to the lab. So I'm going to go into docs, and I'm going to show you what I want you to have as your default starting numbers. You're going to do this immediately. So when you get into the specular area, we're going to change the Fresnel mode from artistic to physical, which we just did. And then we're just using these as our starting default numbers, so something that we can build off from. So edge color is going to be 0.5. So when you see that, it just means this edge color, we want to put that to the value 0.5. And then below that, it says refraction index 1.5, extinction coefficient 0.0. So over here, refraction index should be 1.5. If you just click on it, see it's already defaulting to 1.5. So this is already good to go. That guy's set. The extinction coefficient set to 0. That one's already all set. Now, if you put your mouse over these, the RenderMan help docs are really good. They'll kind of explain what these are. So when the refraction index is set to 1.5, and when this is set to 0, which it is, you are getting what's called a dielectric material. It basically just, think of this like your easy plastics where you really don't have to type in a real number to get a physically accurate result. And I'm not going to get too much into the math behind these guys because it gets deep. Let's not go into that stuff right now. Sweet. Yeah, we're going to talk about this and have you guys memorize that. And we're going to quiz you on it later. This gets super deep. I'm not going to get into like all the formulas behind this thing, but essentially what we're looking at is based on the different wavelengths of light. You know how all colors have different frequencies? They interact with materials different ways, which give you these different refractive indexes on how that color changes as it reflects off the object based on the angle you're looking at. But this whole term, refraction, all this is doing is talking about the speed of light, how the speed of light changes when it hits the surface, and how that's also absorbed or dispersed. Now over here, if you end up leaving these guys at default, which is 1.5 and 0, all you have to do is really just worry about the overall edge color. You can see when you move this up and down, you get variations of intensity. Now, if you guys ever want to make something that's a lot more metallic, that has a much stronger reflectivity, because see how when I crank this guy up, it still doesn't, it's not hitting that mirror effect like we saw before, even though this is cranked all the way up to white. This means you want to go in here and change these guys. Now the good thing is, if you put your mouse over it, it will give you a good suggested range of values. You can see that typically with this guy, the number is between 1 and 3. We're at 1.5, so let's watch what happens if we crank this up to 3. So if I go to the refractive index, type in 3, you can see that now we're getting a lot closer to that chrome-like effect, where the reflectivity in the center is really boosting up quite a bit. And it's the same thing with the coefficient. Same thing, you could go in there, and if you want to boost it up more, you can start cranking up this guy. But again, they all show you kind of the range of values you would typically use. That's 1 to 3. This is usually 1 to 3. Let's try going back here again. All right. I can probably even look up a metal real quick. See if we can do this. Let's do gold. Love this wireless. Really? Or not. We're not going to do that apparently. That was a good time. Yeah, exactly. It's kind of a good point there. So I already made a bunch of presets. We can actually kind of look at that real quick. Let me assign one of those back to the geometry. You can see what it's doing. Like I did, one of the ones I used was this copper hammered. Let me just throw that back on the material real quick and look at these guys. So you can see that the copper hammered one has a bunch of numbers already pumped into it. This is what's giving it that metallic look. So you can see it's got the reflectivity cranked up on it. But when you look at the refractive index, you'll notice that's kind of a weird color for copper, right? Like, why is it cyan? It looks odd because you would not expect that. But when you start looking at the numbers, you'll see that this guy has variations of red, green, and blue. It's telling how each light wave needs to react with that type of material. This works in conjunction with the coefficient. If you go into the extinction coefficient, it's the same thing. This guy has different values for red, green, and blue. You can see the red channel is like significantly higher on this one. That's the main one that's really driving a lot of the color with the copper. I mean, when you guys are working on it, again, don't worry about trying to like artistically necessarily figure out how to use these guys. If you know the material you're doing, a copper, a mirror, chrome, look up the numbers for these. You just type it in Google, refractive index for iron, and you will get the numbers that you can pump into this, assuming you're not connected to the wireless in this room. But you can find it. But a lot of those presets will give you exactly what you need just by loading them in there. So I kind of like this quite a bit because that gives us that extra control just to match something physically correct. Let me throw the other guy back on there. All right, we'll go back here to this one. So for now, since we're not really doing, like the objects in your scene, aside from the metal spacer and the washers, you're not really looking up what the index of refraction is for the metal pulley. Like you're not going to find that. We don't know what it's really made of. You don't know what the plastic's going to be. So we're not really going to be using these ones a whole lot. What we're going to do is focus more on just getting the edge color to work and how to get the roughness set up properly to get the pulley and those to reflect the way you want. So let me start this IPR one more time again. Okay. So over here, if you guys ever want to like ignore these parts, if you're just trying to build this thing yourself and not worry about real physics numbers, let's say for the edge color, or if you want to try pushing a gold effect, you could still go in there to edge color and manually pick the color you want for the metal. Like if I go in there and I'll do like a green this time. If I pick green, it is turning green. Like that will still make it turn to like a metallic object. Because every time you guys see tinted reflections like that, doesn't that feel like it's metal? Like immediately by looking at it? Because we associate that effect with metallics. This almost kind of looks like the green Christmas ornaments you guys probably had growing up, hanging on the tree. Like that's basically what we've created right now. But it's a tinted reflection through this. Now, some of you guys have been using other softwares like Substance Painter. I know you were in like the GA side, so you kind of know about the whole PBR workflow. When you guys start hopping around between different softwares, this slider right here called Edge Color, this is where you guys will be plugging in metallic maps. So have you guys heard of metallic maps before? I'm sure you have going through the GA side. But metallic maps, that's your guy right there. Metallic maps are simply a tinted reflection map. But the brighter the value is, the more reflective it is. So if I make that darker, less reflectivity, brighter values, more reflectivity, and you can obviously go in there and change the color or just use a texture file to tint it to whatever color you want. So this guy is going to give us most of the control we need just by focusing on edge color. And then we all know what roughness is doing, making it blurrier or sharper. Do you guys feel like you have any questions so far just about this area, like how the edge color works, the intensity? I know these are a little trickier because it's a lot of physics, but again, just ignore these and leave them at their default settings unless you need to go in there with a number you found online. Okay. Yeah, question? Yep. Right, so good question. She's talking about, in the documentation, it's saying to move the index of refraction on the books to a different number. It's to turn the reflection on or off. So let's say that I have some diffuse detail here. We're going to make, this is going to look weird. We're going to do a green ball with pink reflections. That seems very believable. When you guys started the project last week on Friday, when you guys assigned the book materials properly, they probably looked kind of reflective and shiny in the render. What I wanted you guys to do is to go to the refraction index and take that number right there, the value, and put it to 1. See how that shuts off the effect of reflectivity? That's just killing it, so you don't see any reflections at all. And then today, if you guys have already shut that off on the book materials, and again, it was just putting that slider to the value of 1, today what you're going to do with the books is put that back to 1.5 just to trigger the reflections to turn back on again. Yeah, just render it first with that set to 1.0 just so it's nothing but diffuse color, no reflections. And then you would turn this back on for the Specular one that we're doing today. So 2 different images. And if you guys do forget to turn it on or off, we're honestly probably not going to be that harsh about it. As long as the final render looks really good, the Specular one, and I can kind of see everything, if the highlights are still on the books in the diffuse render from Friday, I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. All right. So let's try making some materials now and do this with the pulley. Figure out how we kind of dissect this thing properly. All right, I'm going to go back to my display layers. Let's turn off the sphere and turn these guys back on. So we're going to look at the pulley specifically. And we might get to this guy depending on how fast we get through it. Okay, find your pulley material. It's probably still graphed out from the last time you guys worked on it. So here's where we kind of left off. Kind of click on this. Let's see what we've got here. We've got the texture connected, which is that file right there. You guys did the duplicate of that texture, and then you had that going into a black and white ramp with that little out alpha to V coordinate. That's called color remapping. Alpha's luminous is turned on the file node. And then that went into the bump 2D node, and the bump 2D node was going to the bump attribute. And that was buried way down here under the globals, and that's where you guys connected it. So that's everyone okay with that part of it? Just the color and the bump? Okay. So now let's try to get this guy to reflect the right way. What we're going to do is go up here on the primary spec. We're going to approach this just like the lab. We want to immediately change this from artistic to physical. So we're going to change that to physical. And I'm going to put these numbers to our default values. Again, just like the lab. Which means edge color, we're just going to put at 0.5. Just so it's kind of hanging out in the middle, so we can kind of go up or down with intensity depending on how bright it's going to be. So I just want kind of 50% edge color. Refractive index, 1.5 is perfect. Coefficient at 0 is perfect. So we don't have to change these guys. And we're going to put the roughness to 0.5. So I'm kind of trying to get everything just in the dead middle. That way I can kind of vary up or down from that. And let's do a render to see what this whole thing looks like. And I'll start doing like a cropped render where I'm only rendering the pulley in just a little bit. Okay. Okay, let me get the crop. Hopefully you guys have been using that. Crop around it, hit R, and now it's only updating on the pulley. So again, crop is right there. You just drag over the thing you want, hit R to re-render it. Okay, let me do a render kind of before you guys got into this. So if I turn the refraction index to 1, right now there are no reflections on it. But today you guys are going to be adding in this stuff to get a little bit of reflectivity. Now, it's kind of the thing with the pulleys when you're looking at it, we want to figure out a couple things. One, how do I just get the rust and the paint to do different things, like reflect more in the paint or less on the rust? And then how do I get them to have variations of roughness? So to do that, we need to basically make a bunch of black and white textures, kind of like what we did for the bump. We're going to make black and white textures to control the edge color and the roughness values. Now, just from you guys looking at the reference images, like I'll even load these up again. I meant to bring in the pulley today, but I left it on my desk. I'll bring it to the lab, though, so you guys can see it. Where is it? Okay. So, I mean, you all remember what it looks like. You kind of saw it building the textures in Photoshop. What seemed to be like the most reflective part of the pulley? Like the paint or the rust? The paint. The paint's really, really shiny. And you guys probably noticed that because a lot of the paint had these really obnoxious highlights that we had to clean out. So we know the paint should be fairly reflective, definitely more than the rust. Now the roughness is a little bit harder to see, but even here, you can see like that's reflecting. That looks really gritty and kind of broken up though. So there's also a good chance that the rusted part is rougher than the paint. So this has a higher roughness, lower roughness, and this also probably has a lower reflectivity and a higher reflectivity. It's the same thing with the scraper. You kind of look at this guy. We know that on the scraper, the most reflective part would be the handle, right? The plastic is extremely reflective because you guys were probably cloning out these highlights for like at least 30 minutes to try to blend all these together. So how do I get the plastic to reflect without having the rust on the blade reflect quite as much? So to do that, if you kind of come back here, if we wanted to build something for, actually, you know what? I think the first thing I want to do is let's just turn off the color because we already know we got the diffuse color the way we want. So again, when you guys were doing this, when you change the intensity, were all of you doing the gain or were you doing it on the file node? Gain, oh, it's kind of a mix? Okay. If you change the gain, before we do this, just kind of write down whatever that number was set to, because we're going to turn this to 0 for a minute, but eventually you're going to want to turn it back on to whatever you had it set to before. So if you had it set to like 0.3 or 0.4, just kind of make a mental note of that. But what I want to do is turn off the diffuse gain. What did that do to the render? Yeah, we don't have our color there, which makes this a lot easier for us to kind of dissect what the reflections are doing. Because I'm trying to turn color off so I can clearly see the variation we're getting with the reflectivity. And right now, aside from the bump kind of breaking things up, you can see for the most part, like this looks fairly uniform. I mean, can you really make out any of the differences between the rust and the paint at this point? I mean, not really. I mean, I can kind of see the edge of it in the bump, but it's not really any different because we haven't told it to have variation because there's no texture. Let's start with the roughness. We'll do that one first. This one's probably going to have the biggest visual impact, is getting this guy working. So we have it set to 0.5, which is kind of giving us middle of the road sort of blurriness to the highlight. We want to make a brand new black and white texture. Now, if you kind of look at the Hypershade over here, you know how before we were doing this with that color file, doing the little out alpha to the black and white ramp? I just want one more of these guys. I just want a different black and white ramp that I can now use for our specular roughness. So to do that, Let's make a brand new black and white texture. And if you got, I mean, you could also just duplicate this one if you want. If you can click on your black and white ramp you already have in your Hypershade, Command D to make the duplicate. And I'm just going to move that right below the other one. So this was the one we had for bump, hence why I named it bump. This is the one we're going to be doing for roughness. I'm going to call this Pulley roughness. So to connect it, what do I need to do? Yeah, the exact same thing. This file node is going to go to the V coordinate on this one. So you're taking out alpha, just like we did before, and connecting it to a new ramp's V coordinate. Now, if my material viewer wasn't broken, if yours still works, if it hasn't broken on you yet, you can hit the S button and you should see like a black and white texture in the material viewer. But mine's broken at the moment. But this would be your way to preview it. But this is just default, black and white. Let's try connecting that to the roughness attribute without doing like any adjustments. Just connect it as is. I'm just going to middle mouse drag that ramp immediately to the roughness attribute. Let this do its thing. So looking at this, it's a little hard to kind of see what's happening, but you can see it's doing something. There is definitely variation where pockets seem very dark and black. Other areas are a lot softer, where they probably have a higher roughness. So when you're troubleshooting this thing, what you want to do is first off, when it's connected, hit the S on the ramp. See how that allows me to see it on the material? Again, all I'm doing is hitting S. This only works once it's connected to the material. So this is already connected to my material's roughness. I'm hitting S on the ramp so I can preview it. And as long as you have the texture button turned on in the viewport, you guys should be seeing that. Is anybody not seeing the black and white texture when you hit the S button? Like it doesn't show up. Excellent. All right. So, wait, question? Yeah. Where did I plug what? Okay, so that black and white ramp went to the primary specular's roughness attribute. Oh, you want to drag it over here? Yeah, it's right there where it says specular roughness. Kind of near the top. Does that work? Okay, cool. Yeah, and you guys obviously can connect stuff by connecting into this, but since there are quite a few different attributes, I just still find it's easier to find most of these guys on the attributes instead of digging through this section. Okay, now from here, what you want to do is kind of figure out, all right, if I'm looking at it, what would I need to do to really get this to work? So remember how, like we were saying, roughness is sort of like a measurement of kind of bumps or like the grittiness of the surface. So what would be zero roughness? Like you think of materials in the real world, what would be some ones you'd say would not need any roughness? We kind of talked about this a little bit. Yeah, glass. What was that? Yes, shiny. Like some plastics would be closer to that if it's really polished. Like maybe the top of like the Xbox One, I think is smooth enough where that would be it. What else we got? Car paint to some degree, depends on how freshly it's been waxed, but maybe car paint would be closer to that. Water, like a lot of liquids have no roughness. Mirror. So really anything super smooth. Now on the flip side, because remember we're hanging out right now around 0.5 because we put it to 0.5 initially, but we also have 1.0 roughness. What would be extremely rough? Yeah, wood is super rough. What was that? Oh yeah, rust is really rough. Absolutely. Yeah, stone, concrete. The rug in here and the carpet, like that is extremely rough. But like, the interesting thing about this is sometimes when you guys look at a surface, you might think it's not reflective. Like back in shading and lighting, if you guys were creating the material, let's say Tony wanted you guys to try to make the material for the carpet in here, would you guys even make it reflective? That, yeah, you would look at that and think, oh, this is a reflective carpet. It doesn't look it, but we know it's really rough, right? But if you started picking individual fibers out of the carpet and held it up to the light, do you think you'd see shininess on the fibers? Yeah, it is there. The reason why you can't see it is because the roughness is so severe on that thing. It's blurring the reflection to the point where you can't see anything. Just like the wall. Like this, the wall paint looks like it's fairly rough, but you can still probably see reflections like that exit sign reflecting off the wall behind it. Like it is reflective. It's just very, very bumpy. So some cloth may also kind of fall into that. Now, if you kind of think about that, where do you think, if those are a 0 to 1, what would you do with the Pulley's rust? As a guess, what do you guys think you want to say the rust is going to be for roughness? Just thinking about our range we're talking about. 0.8, sounds awesome. 0.8 roughness. Sounds like a pretty good start. Okay. What about the Pulley's paint for roughness? Exactly 0.351. Great. We're going to use these numbers and see like what this is going to do. So this is just you guys kind of like thinking about it ahead of time, trying to visualize and guess what you think the numbers would be. Does this kind of make sense though? Just the 0 to 1 range, hopefully. Okay. Now the slightly hard part is even if you know what you think they should be, how do you get the texture to do that? So here's the trick. Okay, if you go to that black and white ramp, and hopefully you guys are seeing it in the viewport at this point, do me a favor and let's change these to colors. So I'm going to take the black, change this to red, change the white to a blue. And don't even worry about the render. You just ignore that for a second. Let's just look at what the Pulley's doing. You guys all seeing kind of the same thing where it's like a lot of like magentas and pinks showing up? What you want to do is get it so these 2 points control the different parts of the texture. This guy, ideally, should only be doing the rust. This should only be controlling the paint. Now, if you look at what we're getting, see how most of the Pulley's texture is like somewhere kind of in this region right here. Like it's not really red, but it's kind of like a reddish magenta. So almost all of the texture is hanging out in this part of the graph. So let's delete all that. Watch what happens if you move the blue color from the left over. And watch the viewport. I'll zoom in here. See how it's getting bluer and bluer? Moving this in. And if you kind of look at it, see how a few sections are starting to hit like solid, like pure blue? What I'm trying to do is basically move this over until it looks like the blue channel is covering exactly where the paint is. Like right around there, doesn't that kind of feel roughly like the painted area? And now if I go too far, see how it's eroding into the rust? So I don't want to go too much, like, but somewhere maybe around here. That's a value of maybe 0.2, 0.25. Yeah, we'll do a bunch of 0.2. This, and your texture, the same numbers may not work in the lab. Because you know how your texture is a lot brighter than mine initially coming out of Photoshop? So don't be surprised if when you do it in the lab that you have these in a different position. Now, if you look at the rust, see how this is not really red? Again, it's a lot of that same magenta. It's a lot bluer than it was a second ago. Take the red and move it over to the right. And you're just trying to get it so it's somewhere right around there. Now, at this point, it's not bad. You can see how like we kind of are getting some pretty decent variation. It's a little chunky though in some areas, but see how it almost feels like an alpha? like the red is controlling the rust, the blue is the paint. Sometimes when you do this, there are better ways to generate these maps though. And this one still works fairly well. But I want to show you guys like an alternative. Let's find it. Okay, I'm going to load in the Pulley's texture in Photoshop because I kind of want you to see what we're doing to this guy inside of Maya. Okay, this is the one in the lecture project. Again, it's a lot darker than the ones you guys have, but what we're doing inside of Maya right now, you know how we're taking that color file and we're turning it black and white through this little ramp trick we're doing? That is the same thing as you guys in Photoshop taking your color file and then pulling the saturation out of it. Like this is what you're doing inside of Maya, and we're generating a black and white texture. Now the problem with this sometimes is when you pull the color out of it, let's kind of zoom into some areas on the edge of the pulley. See how some of the areas of rust and paint really start to kind of blend together? You can't really tell like where one ends and where one begins. They're all, now over here it's pretty obvious. You can definitely see like chunks of paint, but it does get a little more difficult. Like that patch of rust right there is almost completely lost and you don't even see it. This means when Maya is doing this, when you're doing the ramp trick in Maya, Maya is going to have the same problem where when you yank the color out of it, we're fighting with the values just being so similar that it can't really control both areas. But you know how we've already talked about the color channels are all black and white individually? So look at the color channels for the pulley. Like if I do red, green, blue. Look at the blue channel. Compare that to this. Which one of those do you think would be better if you were trying to control the paint and the rust? The blue, right? The blue channel, without me doing anything, has a crap ton of contrast in it. This means as long as I kind of know that, I could use the blue channel to actually get a much more accurate result and for better control inside of the software. Hopefully that makes sense. So these are all black and white. It's just you pulling the color out with the desaturation, or do you want to use one of the black and white channels that are already built into the file, like the blue channel? So how do we do that? Let's kind of hop back to Maya real quick, because you can kind of tell like the way we did it with the whole alpha channel and turning it black and white. See how kind of noisy that is? It's just not a really clean result. So here's our alternative. I'm going to actually move these back on the other ends of the ramp again. I'm just resetting the position of the 2 points. Where is the blue channel? Like if you kind of look at this setup, where is our blue channel? Right. Because you know how we're yanking out the alpha right now? That's the black and white channel that we're currently using. But if you look at out color, there it is. It's still there on the original file node. So the only difference is if you guys ever determined you want to use a color file to do it, the only thing you're changing is on the file node, pick whatever color channel you want. It's different for every project. And then you connect that to V coordinate. So instead of it being out alpha to V coordinate, in this case we would do out color B to V coordinate. That's it. Now I'm using the blue channel from that texture to drive the roughness. Now it still looks kind of the same, but when I start crunching the points together, you'll notice it looks a little different. We'll move the blue over. I didn't have to go as far over this time. I think I was around 0.2 last time when I did it. Somewhere around there. I don't have to go quite as far, maybe around 0.3. And we'll take the red and move that over. Maybe like 0.12.
Why do you use the alpha?
I could have. It's just at that point, like I think with the bump, that difference really wouldn't have mattered a whole lot. But you're absolutely right. If I wanted to at that point, I could have totally done the blue channel. A lot of the reason I didn't get into that is just because that was the first lecture you guys were even seeing the material. I just want you to kind of build color remapping with the alpha first to get used to it. And I think now that you've done it, we can start talking about more complex ways to use it. But you could totally use blue channel on anything you want. Yeah, let me do that again. All right, let me back up. So just kind of, again, reset your ramp points back to like default. You can even leave it black and white right now if you want. But just kind of put them back on the opposite ends. And again, what I did, I'll kind of back up to the way you guys had it. Do you all have it right now? So it's like out alpha to V? Probably something like that. Yeah, all I'm doing is I'm hitting on that file node that we're yanking the alpha from. I'm hitting the plus next to out color, which is exposing the different individual channels. And you're going to grab out color B and drag that to the V coordinate on the ramp. As soon as you do it, you should see the alpha line disappears completely. It should be gone. It's just overriding that connection with a new channel. So that's what it looks like. And again, this is where you just kind of move the colors on the ramp together until it sort of looks like that blue color is primarily right on the paint. And then you'd move this over so it looks like that's kind of on the rust. So it's almost the same thing as before, but the result's probably just a little cleaner. The projector is actually kind of weird too, because on the projector, it's showing a lot of weird pinks in there. It doesn't look like that on my laptop. There's probably a weird gamma thing going on here. Yeah, let me like try to fix that so it looks right for you guys. Like somewhere around there. I might crush them together a little bit more. Now, if you like slam them together, which you could do, what do you think would be the issue if you do this? Like, yeah, like, I mean, yeah, just there's no blend, right? It's going to go from like paint to insane rust within like 1 pixel. You still want to have a little bit of like a fade between the two where it feels a little more natural. That's where you kind of play around with the distance between the points. Think of it like a feather effect. Okay. So somewhere around there is probably okay. So the reason I'm doing that with color is just so it's visually a lot easier to see where the points need to be. So that looks pretty good for the texture I'm using right now. Now, if we kind of come back to this, remember we were talking about how the rust should be a value of 0.8 and how we said the paint would be exactly 0.351. So remember how this is the rust, right? That's the red part of the rust. What does the value 0.8 look like as a color? Because remember, numbers and colors are all the same thing. If you want that red spot to be the number 0.8, what would I have to do to that to fix it? Yeah, well, if I go to the color, the whole thing is all coming from that guy right there. It's the value of the color. That's what we're talking about. So you don't need to leave the saturation on it. If you want at this point, you could pull the saturation out of the color again. And if you want that to have a higher roughness, we said 0.8, you would put the value to 0.8. So it's like no saturation, value 0.8. That is what the number 0.8 looks like, a very light gray. Now on the blue, this is the paint. We said 0.351. So I'm going to click on this for the blue color. Let me pull out that saturation again. We're going to put the value to 0.351. We just made our roughness map. That's it. No, the higher the value, the rougher, the blurrier. So that is right, yeah. And this is a little weird for some of you guys because they kind of have been changing how roughness has worked over the last few years. Because roughness wasn't on the MIA material. You guys remember what it was called on that one? Had a different name? Glossiness. You all remember glossiness? So it's kind of frustrating we even did it that way, but glossiness is the inverse of roughness, where higher numbers is sharper, which is what you were thinking initially, and this is higher numbers or blurrier. It's just the inverted version of the texture. That's it. But this is roughness. And let's see. Oh, look what happened to my texture when I did that. See how like blurry that rust is? It is really rough, but look what's happening to the paint. It's nice and shiny. Definitely shinier than the rust. So the cool thing about this is because my IPR is still running, like if you look at the reference, all you're doing is looking at the paint. And let's say when you're comparing to the reference, you feel like I don't have it loaded, but just pretend that you look at the reference and you wanted the rust to be sharper. You feel like it's too blurry. What would I change over here to make the rust not as blurry? Right, so the rust is that lighter color. Right, all you're doing is going to that color right there. This is the one doing the rust. And if I bring that color down, which means lower roughness, so watch the viewport and the image tool. See how I'm making that gray darker in the viewer? If I bring it down really low, now what's happening is the area that was painted, or sorry, the area that's rust is really low roughness, and we're now making it a lot sharper. And if I kept going, it would almost be, now it's almost turned to like a mirror, but with bump. So this is now your control for how blurry you want to make that reflection. It's just think of it like a slider now. And so the cool thing about it is once it's set up, it's super easy to go back there and artistically blur and sharpen that part of the texture however you want. Because this is in the right spot. Now I'm just using the value up and down. Same thing with the paint. We know that darker gray is sort of representing the paint. You could say, I want it to be even sharper than it is, bring that darker, and now it's making it even tighter and tighter of a highlight. Do you guys have any questions about that whole thing that we just did? It's easy, right? Is yours like still like showing like a red or a blue? So wait, say it again. Like what's happening? To get the texture back. Yeah. Eventually, what we're going to do when we're done with the reflection is we're going to take that gain and put it back up to whatever we had before. Because right now my gain's 0, which is the texture's turned off. So this is the roughness map. That alone is going to add a lot of believability to it, just breaking up the material, giving us a much more interesting render. Now, the other part that you may or may not even have to do this is you may want to try also using a map for the edge color. So this is the other part. This is just the roughness. The edge color, if you kind of watch what this is doing, let me bring it down. See how this is the overall intensity? Like the reflection intensity for the whole thing is changing as I kind of go up and down with that. You also might want to affect the amount of reflection on those two individual parts. Because imagine like if you guys were doing a material where there were like metallic, like chrome paint flakes on the surface, you'd want to be able to make those paint flakes reflect almost like a mirror. But you want the rest of the surface to not be that reflective. So that's where we get into this guy, the amount of reflectivity. This one's going to be pretty easy to do because right now it's sitting at 0.5 just in the middle. It's kind of the same thing as roughness because usually if the surface is rougher, it visually looks like it's not as reflective. They kind of have a sort of a similar effect. So what we can do is if we wanted the control, we just need one more of these guys. Now, since we already have the colors in the perfect spot, I'm going to duplicate the roughness ramp that we already built. So if I click on that roughness ramp, do Command D to duplicate it again, and I want you guys to do the same connection, where we do that blue channel go into V coordinate, just like we did before. Blue to V coordinate. It's basically just another version of the same thing we just did. But we're going to use this one for the edge color to make it more and less reflective. I'm going to immediately rename that. Pulley edge color. Okay. Usually the way I kind of start this one is once you get this edge color set, you know how on the material, actually let me kind of reset this, we had left the edge color to like 0.5, like right in the middle, and I kind of want to change that, like go up and down. On that ramp that we just built, I'm going to reset this so it looks visually like 0.5, like just like we're currently getting in the render. Change both colors that from here, from the duplicate. Change both colors so they both say 0.5. 0.5. 0.5. See, that's like just a flat color right now. That means when I connect this, because both colors are 0.5, that will give me the exact same result as that right there, which is also 0.5, which means nothing's going to change. So I'm just going to drag this other ramp that I just duplicated to the edge color. So these are your two connections, roughness, edge color. That's it, just those two guys. Now it's kind of, should be accurate. Okay, so you'll notice how it looks exactly the same, because I haven't, it's all 0.5. What this one's going to allow you to do is, even though I have the rust as being really dry and like kind of coarse feeling, if you notice that the intensity of the reflection is too bright, like you want to just drop down the value, I'll go back here. Oops. You know how this one was controlling the rust in the middle? That guy right there. Watch the render if I lower that gray down. See what's happening to the rust? Let me go up. I'll do the other extreme. So it's the same roughness. All I'm doing is, because this is affecting edge color. Remember, edge color is like intensity. You're now able to move this slider up and down, and you're watching the rust reflections change instantly. Brighter reflections, darker reflections. So I'm going to leave mine a little darker for the rust. And if I wanted to, I could go to this guy, which is controlling the blue paint. And if I wanted to push some contrast, like maybe I want to make those highlights right there a little brighter, I could take this one, which is the paint, and make that a brighter white. And now you're seeing those highlights on the painted part really start to pop. And there's another really cool thing about this too is, you know how like we were kind of looking at some of the metals earlier, how they all had tinted reflections on them? Like some had a copper color and gold and tin. The nice thing about this is if I wanted to, let's just kind of pretend that this paint is sitting on top of a copper piece of metal. You know how I'd kind of want that copper part to reflect like copper? Like it should have that kind of warm tone. It's not doing that right now, right? It just looks like a white reflection. But because we're using this edge color map, if I change this one color, because again, this is the guy controlling the rust. We hit the S button on it. See how the darker gray is the rusted part? I could change that to a color if I wanted to. And if I went in there and picked some tone like that, I'm making that part of the material reflect a color, that's the effect of doing a metal. It's just adding a tint to the reflection. That's probably not going to look very good, but let me back up. Where would I plug what? So, this went, that's right. This is going to, right above it, the specular edge color. So what I'm kind of doing here is basically what you guys are going to be doing in the lab. You're just making two ramps, two black and white textures, again, for edge color and roughness. And if you guys think you can get a really good looking result with only the roughness and you don't think you need to make an edge color, I'm totally fine with that. I'm just grading on what it looks like visually, like how close you can get. And some of you may get a really nice render without doing the edge color at all. But I think the roughness is going to be pretty important for you. Now, if I want to turn the texture back on, because right now it's just that reflection, Make sure you put your gain back to whatever you had it before. I'll put mine to 1. And now you can see I'm getting some pretty good details where the paint is sort of reflective. And from here, if I wanted to, I could go back to these guys and kind of looking at the final, get a better idea what I need to do. Like maybe the paint is, not rough enough. I can start bringing that guy up, and I can kind of watch how the highlights on the paint blur. And I could also say, on the edge color for the paint, I want to make it even more reflective. Crank that up to white. And I'm just trying to push that highlight a little more. Yeah, so less reflective, like if you're on the edge color ramp, if you make those values darker, that's going to remove reflectivity. So bright, darker is less reflective, whiter is more reflective. Yeah, on edge color. Right, roughness is the blurriness of it. And you can see the ramps do look different. One is like lighter on that side, this one is lighter on the left. It's going to change for every material. But as long as you know what the attribute's doing, you can pull off almost anything you want. It's just, this is the first time you guys have seen it, so it's going to take a little bit just to get used to kind of playing around with the sliders. All right, there's the pulley. How do you guys kind of feel about that workflow? All right. Yeah, you'll be good. Let me save that. All right. Now, a couple of things here, too. When you're going through the project, and the pulley, I don't really think you're going to have too many difficulties with, because we kind of did it in the lecture, so it's going to feel kind of familiar. So with the scraper, there's a couple of things you want to be careful about with this. One, we know that the blade obviously is going to be way less reflective than the handle, because the handle is made of plastic. It looked really shiny, even in those reference images you guys had. You may kind of find out when you start working on it that it's really difficult to get both of these guys to work with the same material. Because you may get the handle perfect, and then you look at the blade that looks awful. What do you think you guys could do if you're just fighting with getting both of those to work at once? Yeah. I think we even talked about that on Friday, actually. But if you guys want, you don't need to use one material for the whole scraper. If you want, you can just break it apart, combine all the metal pieces together, use one material for the metal parts. Do a different material for the plastic handle, if you think that gives you better control. And remember, too, in the Hypershade, you can duplicate materials. So if you built, let's say you guys do the pulley material from start to finish, and you want to use that as a starting point for your other material, you can duplicate the whole shading network. And I'll show you how to do that real quick. To do a duplicate, if you click on the material, like this is the one I want to copy, you go to Edit, Duplicate, Shading Network. But you have to have the material selected, this guy, not the whole thing. Just the material, Edit, Duplicate, Shading Network. And you have to obviously regraph them because Maya's just throwing that crap everywhere. But both materials are there. If you regraph them, you'll see they're different networks. You can do whatever you want with the other one. Back up. Right. Yeah, question.
Is it okay if we deviate from the reference for this?
Like how so? What do you mean?
Like, is the reference done where the handle is separate?
It is.
Oh.
Yeah, it is like that, but I kind of want you guys to see what happens when you do it, because we've had it, like when we used to do this before with Mental Ray, there actually were quite a few students that were able to get it working with one material. It's based on how they textured it. But for me, like I felt like it was easier just to break it up. But we're not expecting that one way or the other. It's just all about how it looks in the render. So I kind of want you guys to see what happens. All right, and you're doing the same thing for the shelf. That one's going to be super easy. I mean, you can't even see much variation to it. A lot of you guys may get the shelf looking pretty good just by moving the sliders around and not even doing a texture. That's just kind of a very subtle, kind of glossy coat on it, on the wood. And that's what you're going to end up with at the end. That image right there. All right. So I think we've kind of got everything covered that we need to go over today. Let's stop the IPR. Did you guys have any issues saving this thing out of the image tool?
Did it have the XR?
Yeah, it's OpenEXR half. Remember too, when you guys save it out of it, be careful, because if a lot of you are doing IPR renders the whole time, don't forget that your IPR renders are lower quality. Like, that is still kind of grainy. It's because in the render settings, if you look under sampling, IPR, it's just set to a lower number. A lot of you are probably going to be using like the regular full screen render, and you're just kicking it off and stepping away from the computer. That is the top part. And when you do that, make sure that you're looking through the camera and you hit that button on the left. This is the high quality one. What did you guys use for that number? Like when you're doing the lighting project, how high did you crank that guy up? 128. A lot of you may have left it at default, probably. Yeah, 128 is fine. Some of you may go to like 256 if you want. What, doing what one? Oh yeah, totally. Yep. Yeah, you can. I mean, you could crank it up to 1,000 if you want. I mean, you're going to be waiting a bit, but that's all up to you. Yeah, and when you save it, go to File, figure out which image is yours. Be careful you don't save out the reference again. Go to File, Export File, and when this thing pops up, it's already set to the one you want. OpenEXR half, and you just type in whatever you want and save it. Yeah.
When you separate the pulley, do we just have to reapply the texture as it is that we have made, or we have to like crop the texture and stuff too?
Oh, you mean if you broke the pulley into two different pieces, or this? Yeah,
Sorry, not pulley.
the scraper. No, you don't have to worry about cropping out the texture. As long as there are two different materials assigned to the two objects, it should work.
Okay.
But you don't have to like remove part of the text or anything.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So that's it, guys. That's what we're going to be doing in the lab today.